it's time to resume this hearing session on matter 7, which relates to housing supply. So if I could ask those in the room to introduce themselves, please.
Tara Butler, Merton Council.
Paul McGarry, Merton Council.
Eben van der Westhuizen, Merton Council.
Tony Burton from Mitcham Cricket Green Community and Heritage.
And those joining us on Zoom, please. Ms. Moore.
Valerie Moore, Merton Council.
Thank you. And Mr. Sweetman.
Thomas Sweetman from DP9. We're here representing United Westminster and Greycoat Foundation.
Thank you, Mr. Sweetman. Okay, we're just going to we're going to change the agenda around just slightly because we've got Mr. Sweetman with us at the moment. So there was a hearing statement put in respect of this site. It's not one that's been identified as part of the 5-year supply by the council. And just had a question for Mr. Sweetman, really following on from what's written in that hearing statement. So this is the reference for the site is MI14. It's a Tolworth Lane site. So in the hearing statement, you indicate that you support the inclusion of the site, and which is based on a clear understanding of its deliverability. So the allocation as drafted indicates a delivery timetable for the site between 5 and 10 years from adoption. So does that accord with your anticipated sort of timescale of delivery, Mr. Sweetman?
I think it does, yes. So I suppose in terms of our hearing statement, we just wanted to reaffirm, I suppose, our client's commitment to the site. And maybe the use of the word deliverability, perhaps like maybe have a bit of a double meaning in terms of the MPPF. I suppose for us, it was more just reaffirming our client's commitment to the site and bringing it forward.
Thanks. So in terms of that glossary definition of the MPPF, would you agree that it's a developable rather than a deliverable site?
Yeah, I think so. I think, you know, from our client's perspective, we'd work to bring forward the site as soon as possible. But I think, yeah, for the MPPF, we'd be within the developable category at the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Sweetman. And in terms of the 5 to 10 year sort of time range, does that sound reasonable from your point of view?
Definitely, yeah.
Thanks, Ms. Butler. Have you got anything further to add on this site?
Nothing to add, Inspector.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. Have you got anything? Well, thank you, Mr. Sweetman. Thank you for those clarifications on that.
Thank you.
Okay, so now moving on to site MI1, which is the Benedict Wharf site. And so this is identified as an allocation and benefits from outline planning permission. So, Ms. Butler, would you be able to unpack a little further the evidence behind the delivery pipeline for the site and explain the reasoning for the proposed main modifications to the trajectory, bearing in mind what we said earlier about the trajectory in terms of the plan period and so on, and how that relates to up-to-date thinking on how the site will be delivered, please.
Yes, I can, Inspector. I'm mindful of not repeating our hearing statements extensively, But just to say that the site is proposed for allocation in the plan. It's been through a substantial plan. It's also, proposed for removal from its waste management designation in the South London Waste Plan 2022. And that particular plan is at post-hearings stage. The hearings took place in September 2021 and is hopefully due for adoption in the next 6 months, subject to passing its examination. And the Benedict's Wharf site has a planning application 19P2383, for which the decision notice was issued on the 25th of March 2022. Went through a long planning application or planning decision process over 3 years. We have been in touch with the landowner Savills on a very regular basis, and the latest information is that they remain in agreement with a house builder to bring forward the site. The house builder has been involved with Suez and with the site through the planning application process to ensure that the application met their needs. Suez itself is clear and has always been clear that they are a waste operator and not a house builder themselves. Part of both the allocation and the planning application is to facilitate the continued capacity for waste management in the South London Waste Plan area. This is summarised in paragraph 7.29 of our statement, but suffice to say that Suez have full planning permission on a site in Sutton, and this has been used by the NHS for COVID-related activity for quite a while now, but they're due to move off next week. Suez advised it will take about a year to build out their waste management permission. They move off the Merton site and move off after then, and start the house builder will move in and start construction of and reply for reserve matters planning permission. I should have pointed out that 19P to the application number I referenced is actually outline planning permission, not full planning permission. So suffice to say, Suez are on their way to move off the site, and the house builder will be taking it forward from there.
Thank you, Ms. Butler. So in terms of the provision of the waste site on the Sutton site, so I take it the planning obligation restricts redevelopment of the Benedict Wharf site until that replacement facility is operational. That's the wording I picked up from the hearing statement. So what has informed your estimate of the time that's likely to take until the site's operational, the waste site? We've heard that there's the NHS facility currently on site, but that use is due to come to an end next month. But in terms of the build out and then the waste activities starting on that site, how long have you given that for that in thinking about the trajectory?
So as advised that process will take a year. So that's how long we've given from June 2022.
Again, I mean, this is a similar one to the site we discussed this morning, but would there be any scope or potential for a statement of common ground to tie up some of those elements, particularly on when reserve matters applications might come in and might be determined? Bearing in mind what we said about not being seen to prejudge any applications, but in terms of just indicative timings for those sorts of things, is this something that could be investigated?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we intended to submit a statement of common ground with Suez as part of these hearing statements. We just ran out of time to actually pull one together. But we had both agreed to do so. And I think in this case, because there is no live planning application, there are less of the sensitivities than it might be with other cases where there is an active live planning application due to be determined by Planning Applications Committee.
Thank you, Ms. Butler. And again, the same sorts of considerations we were discussing this morning, in that that's something that once it's available, if it's in good time for the stage 2 October sessions, we might well come back to and discuss again. But we know, Mr. Burton, you had some concerns about the timing of the delivery on the site. Would you care to outline those a bit further for us, please?
Yeah, I mean, we've got concerns about, we referenced optimism bias, I think last week, a bit of optimism bias in the 11D5A summary of deliverability on all the sites, with the first sites being completed in 25-26. Feels quite optimistic given the conversations we've had with Suez, given that Suez itself is subject to a takeover bid from Veolia and is currently subject to a live inquiry with the Competitions and Markets Authority, which is as yet unresolved, and historically those things take their time. And in our own conversations with the development director of London Square, who I think are the house builders that Tara mentioned, you know, they're talking about dusting down the application and starting to look at reserve matters timelines later this year. It's a process which I don't think there's much precedent for things moving quite that quickly at that scale to be on site, which isn't to say that we don't want some development on site. We're not happy with the application that's got outline, and hopefully we can improve things at reserve matter stage. But we think it's ambitious, and is it deliverable within that sort of initial 5 years of the plan starting ?
So I mean, just taking it on your point about the potential merger or the takeover. I mean, have you got any further insight onto what that might do in terms of the development and their operational activity of the owner?
I would be speculating, so I don't think I should speculate. All I would say is that the process through which the Competitions and Markets Authority is going is one that, in other experience, you know, takes time. The consequences for whatever the new entity might wish to do for the site, I've got no particular insight into. The reasons that Suez are moving are well known to us, and we really welcome the change in the plan and the reallocation effectively from strategic industrial location to we'd like to see a slightly more mixed use site, and our understanding of the position in relation to the new site on Beddington farmlands near the incinerator is the same as we've heard from the council.
And you had some views, Mr. Burton, on the site boundary in the allocation. Would you like to outline those a bit further, please?
Yes, I mean, we worked with Suez at the call for site stage of this local plan to seek to put in a joint submission, not quite a statement of common ground, but you know, as near as you can, between a civic society and a large waste management company. And it was clear at that stage that the most effective boundary wasn't the ownership of Suez. And indeed, that became clear in a small way through the planning application process, where there was a land swap between Merton Council and Suez on a couple of bits of land, just because it would work more effectively. And there is, and I know preliminary conversations were started, but didn't progress. But I believe that they would be likely to progress quite quickly once an outline or once reserve matters start to be considered. With the what's known locally as the Lambeth Car Pound, the Kappa site to the northwest of the site as allocated, and the plan has always been sort of included it but not included it, and that's the case we understand even in the latest documents. It's sort of in the area, but the red line isn't quite there. There was a dotted red line at one stage. In our view, the site allocation should be constrained by what's the best site for development, not just the accidents of land ownership. And so therefore we would encourage an expansive red line around the site, and we've also encouraged it to embrace what we might call barren fields, which I think the council calls undermowed playing fields, the green space to the sort of southeast and east of the site. Not that that should be developed, but the future of the development is so integral to what happens to that green space. There's so many opportunities for investment in that green space that the two need to be closely linked.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. Any reactions to those points, Ms. Butler?
Thank you, Inspector. Yes, like Mr. Burton said, we're all aware that Suez and Veolia are the subject of the competition authority. And we have asked Suez about this as part of preparing our statement of common ground. Now, I can't put my hand on it to read out this agreed statement at the moment, but the gist of their statement was that they are allowed to continue with certain activities and operations in the meantime, and that they didn't anticipate this delaying matters. We will, of course, make sure that that is down in writing, but that was the gist of what they told us when we specifically asked this matter, which has been raised from a number of sources. On the issue of the boundary, you will see that in Merton's submitted local plan, Regulation 19 OD1 for this site, which is site MI1 Benedict's Wharf, the boundary does include what is colloquially known as the Kappa sites that Mr. Burton referred to. That's a kind of rectangle of land to the northeast of the larger site. You'll see in the OD1, it's outlined separately. Unfortunately, we need to make sure that we can secure some clear interest when we allocate sites from participants, from the landowner. Land must be deliverable. And you will see in our latest main modifications, which is illustrated in LBM05, which is the local plan, including the track changes that includes these main modifications, that the boundary focuses on land that we know to be deliverable or developable, which is the main site. So it excludes the Kappa site. And this is after inquiries we made towards the landowners of the northwest portion who didn't at this time want to be involved in the local plan. Just to say that the issue of allocating Barron's Fields hasn't been taken forward. It isn't proposed for redevelopment, but the allocation itself does point out the relationship with nearby open space, and the planning permission does provide some investment in that open space.
So with the Kappa site, there's no interest at all in redevelopment, that the owner's content that it stays in the current use for the plan period, essentially.
I don't know if I could confirm that. All I can confirm is when we inquired whether they were content to have it in the local plan, that is not something that they were content to do. That doesn't mean to say that they may not come forward in the future. It would be unusual for us to allocate a site against a clearly expressed owner's wishes, but that doesn't preclude them coming forward in the future and the site to be considered at that time.
Mr. Burton, did you have any further views on that?
I respect the situation, and that's our understanding of Kappa's position as well. I mean, our view is that it will come forward. I think given where we are, and it's an important site, not just part of the site, not just because it obviously runs along the whole northwest edge, but also it's fairly important to the access to the tram. So in terms of the accessibility, one of the great benefits of development of this site is suddenly open up. It makes this whole area much more permeable. Suddenly everyone in the church will think that they can get to Morden in 10 minutes in a way you can't at the moment. So the mental map of Mitcham and the relationship to Morden will change. The Kappa site is a real sort of collar which blocks that. Whatever can be done in the considerations of the sewers site to recognise the potential future development of that site and the role that it can play, I think would be extremely helpful. So as and when that does come forward, we at least have got some hook in the policy and the allocation for a future which better integrates it.
Ms. Fuller, do you have any final comments on that?
Just final comments to say that the planning permission I referred to earlier does create a small corridor to access the tram from the site, as the, unfortunately, or fortunately, the Kappa site wasn't part of that application. So provision has been made, but I agree with Mr. Burton that that site would add greater permeability to the area should it come forward. But we've nothing else to add now.
Okay, thank you for that. Just moving on to MI8, Majestic Way. According to the 5-year supply pro forma we were supplied with, the planning application due to be submitted mid-2022. Any updates on that? And then just the second part. So it's an update on the application, or the submission, I should say, of the application. And secondly, given what the framework says about these sorts of sites, could it be said that there is clear evidence that there will be delivery of housing on the site within 5 years?
Thank you, Inspector. I'm going to start and then pass to my colleague, Paul McGarry. I will say that we have been in touch with this and all other sites on this list where we have clear contacts. And the site owner has provided us with details raised in question 10 by yourselves in matter 7, and we've answered those in 7.51. And these details definitely lead us to believe that the proposed deliverability of this site will take place in years 4 to 5 of the 5-year supply. However, just before we published, we checked with the applicant again whether or not the information they provided was commercially confidential, and they established that it very much was. So it's a bit awkward that we're in a situation where we have information about lease lengths and things like that involve not just the landowner and ourselves, but also the leasees, which are confidential at this current time. But suffice to say, we do believe that this emphasises the ability of the site to be delivered within the timescales we propose. Can I pass to my colleague Paul McGarry to just discuss the engagement we're having on the actual application details?
Thanks, Tara. Yeah, so the council's had about 4 pre-apps with the applicant. It's a pension fund who own the assets. As part of those discussions, as Ms Butler said, there is a point in time where there's all the leases terminate at the same time in that development. It's commercially sensitive what date that is, but it does tie in with what we're putting in the local plan here. I will say the pre-app's been a bit protracted due to COVID. but they are active discussions at the moment. So there's been 4 pre-apps on design front. As well as the site, there's a multi-storey car park in the middle of the site, and the council's got a long lease on that. So the council's property team is also in discussion with the pension fund about how and in what terms the council would give up its lease, or what the council would get in return for its lease, to enable the whole development to be unlocked. So there are active discussions with property and planning on that. The pre-app is probably at a stage now where it needs to go out for public consultation. I don't think the applicant has done that yet, possibly waiting until after the elections were done. So I would imagine there is going to be a community consultation this summer. We'd expect an application towards the end of this year to tie in with when the site is vacant.
Thank you for that. Before I ask for other views, so in essence, it's a fairly live, commercially sensitive situation. Would it be appropriate to, again, perhaps look at a statement of common ground, and then return to this at stage 2? And come back to that when you can have your final comments. Mr. Burton, did you want to add anything?
We haven't got a lot to add on Majestic Way. It's obviously an absolutely critical site for the centre of Mitcham. In our view, the balance of uses needs to emphasise the sort of cultural and community role that the village centre needs to be playing in the future, as well as the residential and retail role. It speaks to the wider points we've made about Mitcham Village Centre in relation to that wider policy. And this is one of the, probably the most significant site for delivering that.
Thank you. Ms. Fuller, did you want to final comment?
Nothing to add.
Okay. If you move on to MI16, to Mitcham Gasworks. If first I could just ask for an update on the contents of the statement of common ground here, and the rationale for it, and how it's informed the related modifications, please. If we could just note that we are going to have some more detailed discussions on tall buildings, including this site and in general, tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you, Inspector. It's worth saying with this site that the majority of information came forward both in community consultation and in consultation with ourselves, just as or after the plan was submitted to the Secretary of State. For example, the community consultation took place earlier this year by the landowner, and while we had early pre-application discussions in 2021, the substantial part of the information all came through in the last 6 months in 2022. So it certainly wasn't available when we were drafting the Regulation 19 stage prior to July 2021. So as you will see, inspectors, we are proposing a number of main modifications to this site based on the substantial amount of work that the applicant's done on bringing forward designs, pre-application discussions, community consultation, and extra information that's come through since we drafted Regulation 19 in April, May, June 2021. So the statement of common ground with the applicants is our agreement towards 2 main modifications. Again, this results from this fairly fast moving information coming through in 2022 as the applicant works up their plan proposals. In particular, you will see the difference between Regulation 19 and this proposed modification to increase the number of homes to around 650 homes on the site. This is again as a result of the work done in the interim on site capacity and design. The other proposed modification is to recognise that, in part due to the existence of a telecoms tower and the need to have a building to accommodate this, that one of the buildings on site could increase to 10 stories from 9 as part of the allocation. And although we will be dealing with taller buildings tomorrow, this is also in the context of the statement of common ground with the Greater London Authority, who pointed out that the council's regulation 19 was out of conformity on tall buildings and lacked the detail necessary, such as building heights. I'm going to pause there to see if that suffices, because maybe you have other questions you'd like to raise.
Yeah, I think we're going to talk about more in terms of the rationale for the tall buildings and the design aspects tomorrow. So just in terms of that, Mr. Burton, can we have your views on these aspects, please?
Yeah, I mean, we're pretty disappointed with the way Mitcham Gasworks has been handled by the local plan process. It's important to emphasise we support the redevelopment of the site. It's an important one on the edge of Mitcham's village centre, but we don't believe that the suggested main modifications are robust. It's pretty unfortunate that the council's now changed its mind twice in a matter of weeks on what the allocation should be. So we've had 3 different allocations, which are fundamentally different in their consequences. We welcome the fact that we could support the original local plan site allocation for about 200 to 400 homes, some quote taller unquote buildings. In the context of the area, that would be probably up to 6 stories, and that felt entirely appropriate, and it was helpful that we were aligned with the council, as that's when further information started to emerge about the deal that was being done and the development proposals that were being brought forward. Since then, we've seen, as I'm sure you've tracked, the site allocation was changed in March to, quote, taller buildings of up to 9 stories. And the site capacity was increased up to 450 dwellings in March. And then again in May, we've now got in major modification 4.3 tall buildings of up to 10 stories. And the site capacity has jumped up to 650 new homes. And in all that, we've had deleted from the site allocation consideration of the quote impacts on existing character, heritage and townscape. So you might imagine that that's a cause of concern, particularly when we haven't seen any evidence supporting that change. In many ways, it feels the council surprised itself. Its own 11D 15A, which is the document that you're referencing in your own question, still references as having a capacity of 450 homes, not 650. So it's playing catch up with itself in terms of what the plans are. Our understanding is the council's acknowledged it can meet housing requirements without increasing the capacity on the gasworks site. The only change that we've seen has been a developer interested in the site who came forward with an extraordinary plan for 17 tower blocks rising to 13 stories. The only written evidence that we've seen is this statement of common ground, which we only found very recently as part of the plan process. And if the townscape assessment at the back of that document is meant to justify something of this scale, then we're surprised that the quality of the evidence could be quite that flimsy, given the significance of the change that's being made. A few wireframe images from carefully selected viewpoints doesn't represent to us a robust evidence base. And even those images, you'll notice, have got some dashed heights to the buildings, which suggests that the ambitions may still be to exceed 10 stories, despite that being, we understand, where the plan has alighted. I mean, our understanding is that the planning system is meant to be plan-led. And for Mitcham Gasworks, it seems the local plan is following and not leading what the development industry would like to see on the site. We don't think this is a place for such a level of development. It will create the third highest building in Merton. There's no precedent for tower blocks of this kind in the area. They would cause significant harm to the character, heritage and townscape, which has been deleted from the policy. And there's already helpful precedent on the development of the other half of the gasworks site at a gentle density, which has been well received locally. So we think there was a clear consensus about how this could be taken forward. We feel that the local plan as it is presented has broken that consensus, and the evidence for the change isn't there.
Thank you. Well, obviously we return to a number of these points tomorrow. But just whilst you hear Mr. Burton, and just kind of for my purposes, my benefit, how should the character of the area be described briefly? We'll obviously visit the site.
It's in the context of a low-rise suburb on the edge of a village centre, which already has an established character from the development of the other half, if I can call it that, of the site. At one stage, there was a single master plan, as it were, or brief for the whole site. It's not well. The counter to that is it's not the character of the development as we have seen promoted with freestanding blocks of residential development.
Thank you. Ms. Butler.
Thank you, inspectors. I'm afraid, unfortunately, for the benefit of Mr. Burton, at our morning sessions, I explained that while we have provided the statements in 20th of May 2022 on housing matters, we hadn't managed to update the housing sites pro forma. That's 11D5A, which is dated 28th of March 2022, and we asked the inspectors if we would be able to consolidate this information. So I'm sorry that you missed that point. That you're right, the information in the late March is different to late May. And as I explained, much of this information on the gasworks has come through due to the landowners' activities in the past 6 months. It is worth saying that the promoters of the site is a joint venture between the landowner and a house builder that has built out other gas sites elsewhere in London. On the point of tall buildings, we are discussing this in some detail tomorrow. So I'm going to limit my response now to, I'm going to pass over to Mr. McGarry for comments about the design and character of the area, but just to say yes, that as with any detailed pre-application discussions, the capacity of the site has moved on. We need to make sure we're positive in the terms of developing homes, and we have been provided with information at the pre-application stage, some of which has been subject to community consultation by the landowner pre-application, which leads to us considering that the main modification that you see to increase the number of homes from 450 earlier this year to 650. It is just worth emphasizing that our range proposed last July in our Regulation 19 stage, Mr. Burton pointed out, that's a big wide range of 200 to 400, was based on very broad and very conservative site capacity estimates in the absence of detailed information on the precise designs and capacities of this site. I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Mr. McGarry, to speak about the character of the area and to touch on taller buildings.
Thank you. Mr. Burton's absolutely right about the character of what was built next door. So that was the Barrett scheme of about 10 years ago. It is gentle density, but actually that was driven by the gas holder being in situ at the time. So I don't know if you recall, but the Bunsfields gas holder disaster about 10 years ago, that limited the density of population density around the development sites. That limited the Barrett site down. It does fit with Mitcham. However, the immediate context here it will ultimately be up to the applicant to define that in their design access statement. But it is actually an edge of town centre site, opposite an Asda supermarket, opposite a 6-storey ex-local authority council block, housing block. Mitcham, not very well known for its tall buildings, but there are some creeping to about 6 stories around the town centre. And Fitzbridge Estate actually has a 10-storey tower in it right now, which is visible from the gas holder site. And we mentioned earlier Benedict Wharf. That's probably about a 5-minute walk from this site as well. Benedict Wharf is approved for a series of 6, 8 and 10-storey blocks as well, although it's not built at the moment. So I think I'd also say as well, it may well come up tomorrow as part of the justification for tall buildings. It is one building that is 10 stories to account for the telecom infrastructure and how that has to operate. What's proposed on site is 4 perimeter blocks. They are 4 and 5-storey at the site boundary, and then they build up as you go into site, generally 8. There's 1 9-storey block, 1 10-storey block. So, but again, not for us to defend the applicants that plan. That's what's been out in the public domain, and we're expecting some of that to change as further pre-app discussions happen. But like also, the applicant is planning another round of public consultation later this month, so we're expecting applications to come in shortly after that. I think the other thing I point out in terms of the difference to the site next door, the Barrett site next door didn't have as much decontamination need as this one does, and we've recognised as the developer's gone through decontaminating the site to achieve other local plan goals like affordable housing, housing numbers, the decontamination of the gasworks site was quite a lot of investment to just bring the site to the market and be available. So again, that may well come up tomorrow as part of the rationale for the mix of heights across the site.
Thank you, Ms. Butler.
One more point to add on the community consultation, which is in fact taking place tonight by the applicant for the site.
Okay, I mean, I've visited the site. The gas holder's not there anymore, but what was the height of that when it was in place? Have you got any views on that?
I don't know the exact height, but if you looked at the site now, there's the telecom mast tower on there that is 60 metres high. The gasworks, I would guess, was probably 2/3 of that. I don't know if people in the local community might know the exact height either, but I would just say that was about a 6, maybe a 7-storey building. We can clarify that tomorrow in the session.
So thank you for that. And just Mr. Burton, so just to understand your point, so your content with the regulation 19 version of the allocation as drafted in terms of the capacities that are shown on there and the overall intent of that. We've heard from the council what the proposed modifications are and the rationale for that. So that's something that we'll reflect on when we come to as the examination continues. But have you got anything further to add at this stage, Mr. Burton?
Well, clearly the council has access to information which no one else has got access to, and it is a very difficult situation for us. As you say, the community consultation happens an hour after this meeting finishes today. It's going to the design review panel, but we won't necessarily see all that, and we didn't see it last time on Thursday this week. And fundamentally, it feels like the council is following what the developer is saying is needed. In our view, the council should be on the front foot setting out what's required, and if this allocation is only, as it were, firming up what's an appropriate, so this site is only firming up what's an appropriate allocation because there happens to be an interested developer, then it does beg questions about the quality of the analysis behind the site capacity elsewhere in the plan where there isn't an active developer. And one would hope that the evidence underpinning all those other site allocations was sufficiently robust. We've met the developer last year. We had the conversation about how real this decontamination costs were going to be, what the viability issues were going to be, what the real operational needs of the telecom mast are there alternatives? All these are legitimate questions, but in the absence of actually pinning some of them down, we think it would be entirely wrong to be locking in a requirement for an inappropriate level of development given the character of the area. And that's what the plan as modified would do.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. For final points, Ms. Butler.
Yes, just to say that this is a large site in Mitcham. It's 2.5 hectares, which is pretty substantial. And it is right that where we have evidence that capacity can be optimized, especially where it's to provide affordable homes, it's right that we consider this. It should be pointed out that it's not a fixed number of homes. It doesn't say this absolutely must be provided. So there's scope to provide different, fewer should the particular design facets of a site. So should something emerge, and it is the landowner has been working hard on this site, and we are using the information that's available to us about its deliverability and its capacity in order to inform the allocation.
And just finally from me, Ms. Butler, can you just, question I was going to ask you tomorrow, but it seemed to be convenient now. Just following on from the point you just made about numbers, just the use of the phrase around.
You're referring to the allocation that the council's proposed main modification relating to the number of homes.
Yes, but I should have clarified that. But just curious, really. You often see, for example, a phrase up to. Around could mean. Could it mean 680? Could it mean 600? Maybe that's just something you might want to kind of reflect on that one.
I think we'll reflect on that. Thank you.
Okay, if we could move on to MI18, which is the Wilson Hospital site, and MI2, which is Birch's Close. So we've kind of lumped those two together because they're NHS property holdings. So firstly, Ms. Butler, could you outline the proposed modifications to those two allocations in terms of the anticipated housing delivery and what the rationale for that is, please?
Just one moment while I make sure I'm on the right place. Just to say these relate to question 11 and question 12.
Yes.
So around paragraph 7.52 kind of onwards of the council's statement, and at risk of not repeating the statement, we propose a modification to update the housing trajectory to move the 77 homes that these sites could provide out of Merton's 5-year supply, but into years 5 to 10. Just inside years 5 to 10, it's fair to say, but outside the 5-year supply. And this is based on the evidence of continued dialogue with the NHS and their clear ambitions for delivery of healthcare subsidised by homes, but also the programme or the intentions of moving towards a planning application and the relatively early stages they are at the fine details of any pre-app discussions.
So you'll have seen the NHS hearing statement on this. So in short, the thrust of that is that the way that the policies are worded is restrictive, and it doesn't, it sort of doesn't work with their operational sort of model in terms of asset management. Now, in terms of that, do you think it's a shame NHS aren't with us actually to unpack that a bit further, but I mean, for your views, please, Ms. Butler, do you think a less restrictive policy might bring development on stream quicker, both residential and in terms of the healthcare facilities that are anticipated?
No, we don't think that that is a barrier to delivery of healthcare, which is essentially the primary issue, and it's enabling development of homes. I draw your attention to our statements, which points out that while the NHS rightly point out that they have a funding mechanism which allows NHS property services to reinvest receipts, this is widely. So in other words, that they could be reinvested in the NHS across England. It's not, say, if you sell property in Mitcham, you will definitely invest those receipts in Mitcham or even in Merton or even in London. Our statement points to the Mitcham Health and Wellbeing Board programme, which confirms that as at April this year, the project is not fully funded at this time, and it would rely on those recycled capital receipts, but also bids for other funding. And they mention community infrastructure levy. And also that the ability to retain the receipts from NHS properties located in Merton to help fund the Wellbeing Hub is dependent on the NHS Property Services Board approval. And ultimately, what the plan wants to secure is a health facility in the Mitcham area that's been a very long-held ambition of both the NHS and the council locally. It's recognised in this draft plan, it's recognised in the council's existing local plan. I'm not sure that it's not recognised in the council's core planning strategy 2011. It's been around a while. And we are really keen that this comes forward, and we are supportive of enabling development to do so. But in our view, we wouldn't want to see all the sites sold off and there be no space for health care. We're not saying that that is anybody's plan or that could happen, but we believe that keeping a security on those sites that are NHS owned to provide the healthcare is a fundamental part of making sure that that actually happens at some stage. And we don't believe that's unnecessarily restrictive, given that those are both fairly big sites with different options to be brought forward. I'm just going to ask my colleague, Mr. McGarry, has anything to add?
Yeah, so part of our rationale for keeping the policy as is, which keeps Birchers and Wilson together, we accept that the delivery of the new care facility will need enabling development through housing. We're okay with that principle. As I understand, the NHS, the local commissioning group, have got a business case approved to deliver the Wilson Centre based on parts of the one site and then part of the other site going for housing. Part of our rationale for keeping these allocations joined, as Ms. Butler said, that if one goes for housing, how does that guarantee that the health facility will materialise? And more fundamentally, if that then changes the business plan that's approved by the NHS, I'm sure there's a lot of work that goes into business planning with the NHS and getting approvals. I think if that changes, it's a new business plan again, and people in Mitcham are waiting for longer for the facility. It's been on the cards for a while. So for us, it's a bit of a safeguard that we keep the two sites allocated. Otherwise, one would be sold for housing for profit, but there's no guarantee that profit comes back to the Wilson Care Centre. Yeah.
So, and I think another issue that perhaps that you touched on there, Ms. Butler, is there's a tight sort of land supply situation more generally. So if both sites go, then where are you going to put the health facility? Is that a fair comment?
Yes, that's a fair comment.
Yeah, Mr. Burton, any views on this?
Well, this has been the longest saga in the area, and it goes back well, longer than I do anyway, more than a decade. And it does feel like we are getting to a point where what is not to be the CCG has officially identified the Wilson as the preferred location for the health and wellbeing hub. And I think that has a consequence for the site allocation, which was, I think, drafted at a time when there were other options being considered, including Majestic Way, as we've just heard, or indeed the Birches. And I think that the site allocation can be confident, or should be confident, that the Wilson is going to be the location for the health and wellbeing hub, and as it were, everything else should fall around that. We support and welcome the clarity of the linkage, which has been referenced by the council, and the need to ensure that whatever happens, we deliver the health and wellbeing facility. And there'll be a number of ways in which that can be supported and funded, but it's really critical that we don't start some other form of development and then not end up with the primary facility for which this site, is known and has been earmarked. We have supported the principle of a degree of enabling development from residential, but on the basis that there's really clear evidence it's needed. And we're not entirely convinced yet by what we have seen of the business cases, but we're not privy to all that information, nor are we entirely clear where the figure of the capacity of 39 comes from. If it's just what the NHS property services have come up, plus the planning application that was never implemented along the road, then that's just a slightly finger in the air figure. It seems very precise. We'd rather that was linked to what was required to enable the development to happen. But we do recognise there is capacity. And then we're confused, but it may be that things have changed and we're not aware of it. We had understood that the sequencing of events would have been that the Birches site would have been built out after the Wilson had been delivered. And not least because some of the services, the health services currently provided in Wilson, were going to be decanted to the Birches. At the moment, the document has got the Birches housing being delivered 2 years before the Wilson housing. So we're just confused by that. If there's more information about that, that would be helpful. I can only see that as being justified if the Birches is the only way in which they could fund the delivery of the site on the Wilson, but that information is not available to us that it's necessary.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. So, in any response to those points, and particularly whether the allocation needs tightening up in the interest of effectiveness, particularly in terms of whether the Wilson is the preferred site, and that will be explicit in terms of the site capacities, and then this point of the decanting and the potential phasing impacts. I mean, you've already touched on the reasons for pushing the phasing back further into the planned period, but in terms of how those sites might work together, is there any further work to be done on that, Ms. Butler?
Yes, we will, as already stated, we are proposing a modification to move housing delivery outside the first 5 years, and we will review this. And as Mr. Burton said, and as in the NHS Property Services statement to this matter, page 3, the top 3 paragraphs, they reiterate that the Wilson is currently the preferred site for the health centre, and it sets out a timetable for business case planning to say that detailed design is expected to be tendered by March 2023, with full business case approval for summer 23, with project completion by February 26. This is really useful and helpful. We have been here before. As Mr. Burton said, this is has been a long process, and we will be in contact with the CCG, the organisation that we're promoting it to, and we will look again at this. However, the council is minded to consider a level of flexibility on this. The intention is to see a successful health facility delivered on one of those sites, enabled by residential development. And while we can use this information to narrow this down to just the one site, we need to be sure that that full business case due to be approved this time next year wouldn't throw up something that meant that there might be a change of plan. So we will work with the NHS and others to consider whether we tighten this up, but we are mindful that we want to provide both certainty, but also an element of flexibility to make sure that this results in a healthcare facility.
Does the council have any preferred site in terms of where the provision should be?
So working with the NHS probably in 2018, the council and I think the community were involved and informed of the site search. The Wilson is the biggest site, but at that point the NHS hadn't fully clarified what its space requirements were. I think they've got that now with the strategic outline business case. Birches we didn't think was suitable for the medical facility because the access road is pretty much a single lane road. It's a one-way in cul-de-sac. It could not take the traffic required to service that facility. So like we've always recognised, Birches probably would be housing, with Wilson being the biggest site, and whatever was residual on Wilson could also be housing, but clear on the proviso that the medical facility is, spec'd up, delivered, and enabled by the housing. So so like the statement, we understand. I think Wilson is the current site going forward.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Burton, any further points on this?
Just a small point about the allocation of the birches, because for the same reasons that the constraints on that site are really quite extreme. And it's already seen significant conversion of office to residential along this very narrow cul-de-sac, which in our view should be, effectively a home zone in absolutely the heart of the conservation area. It literally runs alongside the oldest cricket ground in the world, and it's in the most historic site in the area. Has it got the capacity for 38 or 9? Is it 38? I think that's an open question. We've not seen the evidence that it has, and we believe that there are issues about can access be provided through other routes. What's known locally as the dementia hub, which would provide an access through the residential streets the other way, and that would potentially, if considered together, I think provide a better way of thinking about the Birches site. As it is, I think it's pretty constrained, and it's going to be difficult to see how 39 dwellings could fit on it without a significant negative impact on the conservation area and on that access.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. So in terms of that that capacity, how was that derived in terms of informing the allocation?
So as part of preparing the plan, we had done a bit of work with the Mayor of London's office on the small sites assessment work, so that was there. It was informed by urban design master models on what we felt was appropriate for the site, but also recognising there was a previous planning permission for the Birches, which sought to keep the original house at the front and puts development at the back, fairly low rise, very gentle density. So we felt that was appropriate there. The site, the traffic impact of it, we feel the traffic would be off the Cricket Green Road and into the site as well. So again, all that would be tested at planning application stage, but we looked at the retaining the original house, infilling in a backland site of a conservation area, and we felt that was an appropriate density for that site.
Okay, and the planning application, did that predate the prior approval changes?
Yes, I think it was, I'm looking at Mr. Burton at this point. Yes, it was a substantial time ago, I'm pretty sure.
The planning application I was referencing was the conversion of a large office fronting Cricket Green, which is the name of the road, which has substantially changed the use of that. We've also had a school open at the end of that road. So the point being that the land uses have changed along that road to the point where it's already at capacity and is already having a negative impact.
Okay, thank you. Just moving on. Our question 5, issue 3, and this relates to MI4, 5, 11, and ML2. Obviously, a number of sites allocated in the plan that council owned. Council has resolved to dispose the sites to facilitate their residential development. And all of the sites have a council resolution to grant planning permission subject to what we refer to as enabling agreements. Could I ask, is the sale completion still on track for summer 2022, please?
Yeah, so the 4 sites I referred to is MI4, Elm Nursery Car Park, ML2, Farmwood Church. Did I miss some on the list? Yeah, so those ones are the 4 council-owned sites. They were developed as part of the council's property company between 2020 and 2022. There's a resolution to grant on them. The council decided not to then go on and build. Things were happening in the market at the time in 2020, so it never actually concluded this section 106 on that. There is a resolution now through Cabinet to dispose of those sites to deliver affordable housing. So the council's property team are now looking to market those sites to a provider who can deliver that. That was held up slightly by the election, but they're still actively working on it. So I understand it still will be summer when there'll be a way forward as to how those sites will be delivered and developed. It's at that point, once we know the delivery mechanism, where the section 106 will be signed. And whether that's a council direct delivery or a housing association, that'll depend on the disposal mechanism. So it is active.
So just so I'm clear, that's, Mr. McGarry, that's resolution to deliver affordable housing on all 4 of those sites.
So the Cabinet decision last year, they never went through planning at a level of affordable, but the Cabinet decision last year was to dispose of the sites to deliver affordable housing in all of them. So the council's property team is now looking to see how it does that. Merton Council doesn't own council housing itself, so that's why it's potentially disposal to another partner.
Solely affordable housing.
That is the intention, yeah. So it would use the existing permissions, but be built out by a housing association.
So that's a targeted marketing exercise to the housing associations who are active in the area.
Yeah, so there's RPs active in Merton. There was a soft market testing undertaken March into April, and then it was paused till the elections to happen. So we're now clarifying the wishes of the new administration.
And that's something that we could perhaps come back to part of the stage 2.
Yeah, I think so.
Presumably
By
there'll be an
October,
update
there'll be
since then.
the retraction then. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're in a similar situation, aren't we, to some of those sites we discussed this morning, that there's the elections held up a bit of the progress around those, but given that we've got a stage 2 hearing session, we can have an update by that point, and by that point we might have further questions if things haven't moved on any further. But Mr. Burton, have you got any views on those sites?
Well, we've got a lot of views on what was appropriate development on the sites, but we're obviously aware that planning consent has been given in very controversial circumstances. But those planning permissions are not now being delivered, and the scenario that's just been painted would require a very different proposal, because what has been consented was 3 of the sites being used for market housing and 1 for a definition of affordable housing. What's now being suggested is a very different model and would require a very different approach. So that in itself, I think, is raising questions about the deliverability of these sites within the time frame 24-25 that's being suggested in the documents. The very fact that the local authority's own property development company was unable to implement the sites despite having planning consent, I think, is a further sort of raises further questions about the realism of delivery of the sites. The election, the new administration raises a whole set of new uncertainties, which, you know, again, we probably shouldn't speculate on, but I think it simply means that we cannot see how these sites are. It's not just about sort of giving someone else and handing them a permission and saying get on with it. It's a much more complicated picture, and it is likely to give rise to some of the concerns, particularly about the most sensitive of those sites, about the way in which that development is taken forward, and raise, you know, other design and other considerations.
I think there were probably some points you wanted to come back on there, Ms. Butler.
Yes, there were, Inspector. The details of the closure of the council's development company, Merton Development Limited, are contained in the public domain in a meeting of the 21st of December 2020. And it's important to note that the closure was the reason for the closure was not the precise viability of each and every one of those 4 homes, but around the council's appetite for risk and the increasing borrowing costs that the council was subject to. So, for example, in the minutes of that meeting, it states, it was noted that a commercial developer would not have been subject to the increased costs of borrowing that local authorities were subject to. So it is around the totality of the business plan in relation to the council, and not development viability in the precise sense that we would know it for planning decisions. Also worth noting that it is not unusual for housing providers, affordable housing providers, to buy sites that have planning permission for homes, both of affordable and private, and deliver these out. This has happened on a couple of big sites in Merton in the past decade, where permission has been granted with a small or large percentage of affordable homes, but also a percentage of private homes, and an affordable housing provider has come in and bought the site either before it's been built or after it's been built, and redeveloped it for a larger percentage of affordable housing or the type of homes to meet their needs.
Okay, is the 21st of December report on Merton development in the examination library?
No, it isn't. We can, it's a level of detail, but we can add, it's in the public domain, and we can add this to the examination library.
Thank you. Yeah, if we have it as a, happy to have it linked through to where the relevant document is, but if it's given a reference number as well, please, that'd be useful.
Okay, and obviously we've noted those points, and we'll return to them at stage 2. So moving on to MI19, Worsfold House. It's another council-owned site where disposal is due imminently. Is there any further update on this, please?
Just to say, as per our statements in matter 7 around paragraph 7.65 and thereabouts. There isn't an update since then on the precise details of disposal since May of this year.
So following on from that, no planning permissions in place for this. Do you think it's cutting it a bit fine in terms of getting permission in place in 2022-23, especially if a land transfer has not yet taken place or needs to take place?
So the council has been approached by a affordable housing provider. They are it's specialist housing provision, so that our housing department are working with that with the property department. That is taking its time, so I think you're right, it's cutting it fine, but not impossible. If those discussions conclude this summer, and we had applications in 2023, we think that it would fit in with the timeline we've got in the plan here. It's quite a small, discrete site, as in the conservation area, but quite well screened and hidden. But largely it's about the housing offer on that site and the housing association being able to access grant to achieve that. So that's the discussions that are going on at the moment between the property and housing teams.
And just if you could just outline, in your view, what that would mean in terms of the timetable. So you think there'd be a proposal by the end of this year?
Yeah, I think I've tried to recall the cabinet report from last year about the disposals, but I think they were running into autumn, winter this year. So if the disposal was done then and planning activity took place in 23, I think there's enough time to get on site to deliver these by 25. Is that what we're saying? Yeah.
So given that, would it be more likely the planning, the permission had been placed 23, 24? Did there be an application in perhaps towards the end of this financial year? Again, it looks tight to get an application in and get the permission in by the end of this, by say March 23, doesn't it? Do you think that's a fair comment?
Yes, I think we'll certainly consider this, but the delivery capacity is listed for 25, 26. Oh, no, it's not. It's for 24, 25. So we will look at this carefully.
Mr. Burton.
I mean, we're broadly supportive of what's being proposed here. We thought that the, for the reasons just discussed, the delivery was somewhat ambitious for 24-25. The council had already announced disposal of the site to Clarion Homes for 60 dwellings in July 2019, but chose not to proceed with that, although I have to note it did require a freedom of information request to find out that it was choosing not to proceed with that. We've got no evidence as to where the 60 comes from, the capacity for the site. It is a discrete location, but an important one in the conservation area between effectively institutional buildings with the significant number of schools and special needs schools in the area, and historically been used for offices. So quite sensitive in terms of the changing character if it's converted to a residential use. And we have made more detailed proposals for some of the nuances in the site allocation itself, particularly about the improvements to the site boundary, to Church Path and other considerations, including barren fields, because it backs onto barren fields, just as the Benedict Wharf site does. I should flag for the record, we were unable to comment on this at stage 2A, public consultation, because there was no detail provided on this site in the draft plan that was circulated. We got a repeat of the details for Mitcham Fire Station, and we did flag this, but no alternative wording was provided. So in a sense, we skipped a consultation phase to know what the council's thinking was on the site.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. But comments were provided at Reg 19 stage, were they by Cricket Green? Yeah. Okay, anything further on that?
Yes, and we apologise for the error at stage 2A, as evident from our submissions, and since the council undertook 2 stages of, well, 3 if you count the call for sites, 2 stages of Regulation 18 consultation, and both of them longer than the statutory minimum of 6 weeks. And we apologise for missing the site details from the second of those stages. It is worth drawing your attention to our statement, paragraph 7.65, to point out that the council has worked with the One Public Estate programme, which is a Cabinet Office funded programme which seeks to deliver new homes and jobs and optimise the use of the public estate. So that includes local government, the NHS, the Ministry of Justice, Fire Service, and all sorts of public authorities. And we did site capacity work across a number of public sector owned sites as part of this. And we engaged with the house building industry on this site, particularly the affordable industry. As Mr. Burton pointed out, there was a previous proposal in 2019, I think, to bring forward this site with a particular provider. And that's what has informed the housing capacity.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Butler. And just to note really that we intended to discuss the wording of allocations in much more detail where relevant at stage 2. So again, Mr. Burton, in terms of this site, we'll take on those points at that stage. But really, we're focusing on the deliverability and the justification for that at this stage. So that concludes the questions we have, developing them further on from the hearing statements that we've received. Is there anything, any other sites within that 5-year supply that anyone wishes to raise at this juncture, Mr. Burton?
I mean, I don't think we want to go into the detail of it, but we did make some very detailed proposals for changes to the wording of the site allocation in relation to the Burn, Bullock and Mitcham Cricket Pavilion. And they're informed by pretty well sourced legal advice from Town Legal, which in our view would help the council deliver on the shared objective for the restoration of that historic building at risk and the long-term security of the tenure of the pavilion and appropriate associated storage on what's obviously an important historic asset.
Yes, thank you. I mean, that's one that the plan assumes will be delivered in years 5 to 10 of the plan. So it's something we'll be coming back to at stage 2. But thank you for flagging those points, and that'll be a useful thing to discuss at that stage. Thank you, Ms. Butler. Anything to add on this matter?
On the issue of the Burn Bullock, just to say that, as you rightly say, we will be discussing it in detail in October. Our submitted schedule of representations, document reference OD6 sets out both the representations and the council's response to it. But nothing else to add on further sites.
So thank you. So thank you all for your contributions this afternoon. So that concludes our discussion on matter 7. I think we'll take a short adjournment just for 10 minutes and then come back and do our our housekeeping matters for the afternoon. So thank you. So the hearing session on matter 7 is now closed. Thank you.